Well, what is this thing called depth of field, and how does it affect my images? Well, to start off with, depth of field can be defined as the apparent distance of the objects in an image that appear in focus. The best way that I can get it in my head is at a certain distance, something's going to be in focus, and beyond that distance, it's going to be out of focus. So think of a plane, think of an invisible wall, and that will dictate the area that's going to be in focus. Now, the wall can have varying thickness depending on what the aperture of your lens is set at. Now, the aperture is the opening of your lens that allows light in through the lens. And it can be very small or very large. And for the most part, I think I just want to talk about it as being larger or smaller depending on what number it is. The thing that's confusing with aperture is that the smaller the number, the larger the opening. The larger the aperture number, the smaller the opening. But all you have to really know is the smaller numbers, our smaller aperture numbers, are going to give us less depth of field than our larger aperture numbers. Our larger aperture numbers are going to give us more depth of field when we're talking about aperture. So let's take a look at some examples, because I think that's better than talking about it technically, and you can see what these examples will provide. Now, in this first example here, we're looking at some pictures of some dancers here, and in this image you'll notice that the foreground is out of focus and the background is out of focus. What's in focus is this part in here in the middle. So this is what would be referred to as a shallow depth of field. So only a shallow or a small area, if you think about the analogy of the wall, it wouldn't be a very thick wall. So only the part of the wall is what's going to be in focus. So that's why only this part's in focus. It's a little blurry because there's some camera shake here. That has nothing to do with the focus. That has to do with the movement and the use of a slow shutter speed. Now, the thing that we have to be aware of when we use depth of field is sometimes we're limited with the depth of field depending on how much light we have. So sometimes we can't get everything in focus. We can't have the foreground, the background, the whole image in focus by using a small aperture or a large number aperture, because there's not enough light and we would not be able to expose the image enough. So shutter speed and depth of field and ISO are all integrated. They're all interconnected and will allow us to get the correct exposure. Let's look at some more examples here. Now, in this example here, this is a smaller number here that I used for my aperture. So this number was 2.8. And again, this provides us a very shallow depth of field. And I think it's easier to think about those terms: shallow depth of field, deep depth of field. So this shallow depth of field, the foreground is not in focus, the background is not in focus, and just what's in the middle, or what I focused on with the lens, is in focus. And that is relative to the focal plane of the camera. So however you point the camera is going to be relative to what's in focus. Now, here's a technique where I made the foreground out of focus and put the background in focus. This is not a real shallow depth of field. So from probably the water on is in focus. So it's a pretty deep depth of field, but using an aperture like f8 or so, what's close is going to be out of focus and what's farther away will be more in focus. But it's a nice feel to the image, and it gives you a nice technique. So if you always shoot with the aperture at a high number, you're going to get everything in focus, and that's not going to always give you a really exciting image, or an image that has much visual appeal to it. So you got to play with this stuff a little bit. Now, this image here has a pretty shallow depth of focus. The reason for that, though, in this image is because of how close I am to the subject. So in macro photography, because you're so close to the subject, you have a very shallow depth of field, even when you're using small apertures or large numbers. So, for example, this was shot, I think, at f/22, which normally, if you were far away from your subject, you would have everything in focus. But because I'm so close, it provides a shallow depth of field here. What else affects depth of field? Well, lens length affects depth of field. If you're shooting wide angle has more inherent depth of field than a telephoto lens does. So this was shot with a wide angle lens, and even though I was very, very close to the eel here, the whole thing's in focus because it's a wide angle lens. So with wide angle, you can still get very close to your subject. And really, with this wide angle lens, this is a fisheye lens. It's a 10.5 millimeter lens, a very, very wide angle. For the most part, no matter what my aperture is set at, most of the image is going to be in focus. What generally falls out of focus is down in the corners and in the foreground. But even so, this was shot at f/16 or I think f/16 or f/22. And it did a really good job, even though I was very close of getting everything in focus. Okay, here's another example of that. With a wide angle lens, fisheye lens, shooting very close. I was very close to this turtle here, and I was even able to get the diver that was back in the background here in focus, and the diver was pretty far away. Very deep depth of field here that is provided by wide angle lenses. Now looking at another factor that affects depth of field, and that is the distance to the subject is going to affect depth of field. Now, when I took this picture, I was pretty far away from the subject here. Everything's in focus from the foreground to the background because I was far away. And so even though I shot this with a telephoto lens, so I shot this with a telephoto lens like a 105 millimeter lens, and the aperture was around f8 or so. Most everything was in focus here. And again, the reason for that is because I was far away. So the farther away from your subject that you are, the more you're going to get in focus, the more depth of field that you're going to have. So when you're shooting landscapes, you're shooting something that's far away, you're going to get a lot of depth of field no matter really what aperture you're shooting at. Even if you're shooting at the smaller number apertures, which generally give you stuff out of focus, or the larger number of apertures. But if you want everything super, super sharp, then I would recommend shooting with the higher numbers, f/16, f/22. Okay, now here's another example with the same lens, the exact same lens and the exact same aperture. So I'm pretty sure this was at f8 as well, but because I moved in really close, what happened was I lose depth of field. So the closer I am to my subject, the less depth of field I'm going to have. And you can see part of the background is now blurred. Okay, again, exact same aperture. So distance to subject affects depth of field greatly. So I'm going to show you a couple of other examples of getting in close and how it affects the focal point, how it affects depth of field. So again, with this image here, macro, super, super close to the sea urchin here, and the foreground's out of focus, the background's out of focus. Okay, all that's in focus is what I focused on in the middle. Very limited depth of field here, but it makes for a very beautiful image here because we focus on this area here, which is actually the anus of the sea urchin here. Okay, here is an arrow crab, kind of the same thing here, but we're going to bring in something else into play here with focus, and that is the angle to the subject. Okay, because I was very close here. Again, I had a limited depth of field, but all this is in focus here because it's parallel to my camera. So when something's parallel to your camera, you're going to be able to get everything in focus. What's not in focus in this image is the stuff that's at a different angle to my camera, okay, or behind the plane of focus. So it starts falling off, the focus starts falling off because of that. Let's look at some other examples of angle. Okay, so in this image here, the angle. Right here, this area here is in focus, but as the angle changes, so this is more like a 45-degree angle, I have less in focus here. But it gives much more visual interest here. It provides for a much more interesting image. You don't always want everything in focus is one of the points I'm trying to make here. Let's look at another example of angle. Now, these two are really good because this is like at a 45-degree angle, and you can see the front here is in focus, the back here is more blurred. Now another image with the exact same aperture and everything is in focus because this is parallel to the camera, to the film plane. Depending on what kind of effect you want to get, and it's a very different effect. Still very strong images, but very different effects. This is also an example here of angle. So again, parallel, pretty much everything's in focus here. And then in this example here, I wanted to show you this because this is a little different in that everything with this image here, the parts that are in focus here, are pretty much on that parallel plane there that we talked about. So even though it's very, very shallow depth of focus, I was able to position the camera to try to get the best focus possible by changing the angle. The next thing that I want to give you examples of is actually aperture. So looking at different subjects and varying the aperture and looking at what kind of effects you'll get. So this is probably shot at 5.6, and you can see the foreground's in focus, and then we start getting varying degrees of focus in the background here. So this is a little bit in focus, and then it falls off, and this is totally out of focus here, and the background's out of focus. Depending on the number you use, you can vary that. This image here was shot at 2.8. So at 2.8, the foreground is totally in focus, the background is super, super blurred. So changing the number makes a difference in how much depth of field we got. Another image here is where we change the aperture as well. So this one was shot at f8, and at f8 we can see here that this is out of focus in the foreground, out of focus in the background, but the main image is in focus. Now back over to here, this image was shot at f16, and you can see here this foreground is more in focus, the background is more in focus, most of the area around the image is in focus. Now the advantage of using a f16 over using f8 is I'm going to have more of a chance of my main subject being in focus. Whereas with this image here, you can see a lot of this stuff is out of focus. There is more of the chance that I might not get the eyes in focus or whatever I want to get in focus because I have a shallow depth of field. But shallow depth of field, I think, really provides for some interesting images. So try to experiment with your camera using shallow depth of field. Check to see if your camera has aperture priority. If it does, use this setting to be able to play with depth of field. In aperture priority, you can set the aperture and the camera will set the shutter speed. So you can set low apertures or high apertures and see what effect that has on your images. Remember, small number, shallow depth of field. Large number, deep depth of field. Move in close to your subject, change the angles to your subject, try different camera lengths, play with depth of field to get some really strong images.